All right, this is Andy McNeill, another edition of Free Arkansas. And today I'm talking to Sarah Moore. Sarah, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Sarah is a mom and on the city council. And I would even say an entrepreneur. I mean, I understand that you founded Arkansas Justice Reform Coalition. And so I think starting anything sort of makes you an entrepreneur. And I guess for a businesswoman for a while as well. I don't know if you sounds like you got a ton on your plate. I want to, before we tell your story, I just want to talk about the criminal system or the prison system or the jail system, everyone articulated, and see if we can just agree on what the problem is in Arkansas. Because I think the statistics are pretty interesting. And I'm going to guess that you know them better than I do, but I'm going to tell you what I think they are. And maybe we'll see if we can just start there. So I think if one looks into Arkansas, you would say that we have a super high incarceration rate, that we have overcrowding. Would you agree with all those at a high level?
We're currently aligned, yes.
Yes. And that's before we even get into all the reasons why that is. So that'll give us about 18,000 people that sit in the state prisons,
right,
which is not quite double the national average, but it's significantly higher than the national average and way, way higher than the global average. So we're the third highest in the United States in terms of incarceration rates. And if you include county jails, detentions, immigration centers, it's even a huge number, which sort of puts us in the highest incarceration rates. Like we're up there with El Salvador, and so anything about what I just said that's wrong there?
No, you're right on.
Interestingly, I think that what's also interesting is that I think it costs a lot of money, but so we spend on the state prisons about $75 a day, or a little less than $30,000 a year. So $450 million of taxpayer money go to support the prison system each year, which of course is a staggering number. Interestingly, it's much lower than other states on a per day basis, which we, I think, have capacity in our state prisons around 15,000 people. We currently have 18,000. So we're over capacity. So we lack enough beds. And then our recidivism, I just still can't say that.
Recidivism.
Yes, I think it's a little less than 50%. So like if you go to jail, you're going to go back to jail in 3 years. So I guess I'll start with this. It's like, are we just like bad people? Is it just, we would say Arkansans we're just going to be, rob more, be more violent. Is that the problem?
No, I'm a mostly lifelong Arkansan. I did a 2-year stint in Texas, and Arkansans are compassionate, community-minded, wonderful people. Unfortunately, we're an incredibly poor state.
Right.
We're under-resourced in many areas. And so our quote-unquote solution oftentimes is punitive measures and caging and locking people up who we either don't want to deal with, don't understand, or seem to, unfortunately, not be willing to invest in the solutions and the systems that actually would improve public safety, help individuals to be contributing members. And that's in so many realms. I mean, we're in a public health crisis, we're in a housing crisis. And so when you have a vast array of unmet needs, unfortunately, that's going to manifest itself in things in our community that maybe we dislike. And so in our systems today, with the amount we're spending, while you talked about it being less than other states, we have lack of access to programming. We have individuals that are not getting appropriate health care in our system. And so you do see this churn of individuals. There's a high likelihood if someone has an interaction due to a mental health crisis or the need for recovery services, and they're met with a arrest and a carceral response, there's a high likelihood they're going to continue to stay in that pattern.
Which is pretty sad. You started the Arkansas Justice Reform, I think, Reform Coalition back in 2017, is that right?
Early 2019.
2019. What was the thing that happened that I've heard you speak, which I didn't tell you before, but I've heard, but I don't know why you started it. Like, what did something happen personally that like just launched you into action?
Yeah, I mean, again, lifelong Arkansan, and the straw that broke the camel's back for me was, um, I grew up in poverty. I had a single mother, kind of that whole struggle, and my family always said, just kind of avoid these systems. And I bought into the lie that if I just mind my p's and q's and am able to just kind of avoid these areas that don't work right, then everything will be fine. And so in my uh, early adulthood, I struggled for 15 years trying to navigate systems in Arkansas around mental health, trying to get addiction services for people I love who their lives were put in great peril. And I showed up to, after a year of watching in Washington County conversations around opening a crisis stabilization unit. This life saving resource was a year delayed in opening. And so, as a person who had spent 48 hours at a time up with a loved one with serious mental health conditions, going to facility after facility, trying to get them care, only to be met with no, 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 and struggling, I showed up to a county meeting, and I don't even know if disappointing is the right word.
Um,
I was devastated to see that with a background that I have in like data analysis and a business background, I was really shocked at the conversations, lack of sophistication and study. Whenever our sheriff at the time, Sheriff Helder, stepped up and said he wanted to double the size of our local detention center for 40 million extra dollars in our county,
right.
there was no study. There was no, deep dive into like what were the causes and the reasons. It was just a very simple explanation of our county is growing. We should lock more people up. And I
Right.
was just livid. We couldn't even get this life saving, less than 20 beds open for mental health. And yet here we were talking about another 700 beds to lock more people up. I just couldn't believe it, and just started chatting with other community members. A couple of people that were there that night, some other local concerned community members, and found that people from all walks of life and backgrounds had these shared common thoughts that we should be doing things better. And it kind of just took off from there. It was a very organic. I mean, it's interesting. I'm where I'm supposed to be. I know I'll do this work the rest of my life. And, I'm thankful that I was in that space at that time. But I mean, that really is what facilitated it, was just finally knowing that we could do it better, being so disappointed in who was in leadership that was entrusted to be doing the right thing and not seeing them fully vet out all the possible solutions. And knowing that we have the resources, we're smart enough, people care enough. And so I think we
Right.
can do those things.
So do you advocate down at the State House when the legislature's in session?
So our work has found us in a lot of places.
Okay.
We work on education and awareness, which is really myth busting, and it's really telling what's happening instead of anecdotally in the state of Arkansas. We're not always real great at recognizing what's happening in totality. We talk about just one data point, and that's extrapolated to be what's reflective of everything. And so that did lead into policy work. And so we've worked on local ordinances and resolutions. And we've been in the last 3 legislative sessions, both running bills, but also a lot of what we do is trying to mitigate harm. The last legislative session, the legislature worked to criminalize almost 30 new things. Some of those things had only been put into law the previous session and had
Right.
enhancements added. So we try to have a more logical conversation about this balancing act that needs to be occurring.
Sometimes works of fiction can highlight something for you. It kind of show you something that you didn't see, like, open up a blind side. And so recently, I love to read. So recently I read this award-winning book. It was written about 25 years ago, called The Known World, but it's a story about slavery. What I would say about it is, as a reader leaving the book, you come away with this understanding that, even if you didn't think it impacted you, it impacts you, right? And so I wonder, like when I look at the criminal system today, so often it's sort of like you did something wrong, it's black and white. We should throw you over into this cage and lock the key up for a certain amount of time, whatever it is. And 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 you just sort of like put it out of your mind, right? And so I wonder if part of it is just like that human element where to kind of say to people like, wow, is that like really the best we can do? And so because do you encounter that? Because I so often the politics plays out at this high level, like,
Mhm.
I don't want to parole this person because I don't want to be considered soft on crime. And if they do something bad, there's going to be reflection on me. And it's just easier just to lock them up and throw away the key because they're bad, which is why they're there, And
Yeah.
so
No,
without going deeper.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is unfortunate, and we play life and elect people in sound bites sometimes. And so you're right, the tough on crime, that kind of rhetoric oftentimes sells itself really well to voters. But when we drill down, and I think this last year and conversation around this possible mega prison in Charleston has really broken that wide open, that
Right.
as individuals started to understand the actual human cost and toll, I mean, so many of us are seeing people very close to us, our neighbors, our cousins, our kids, our brothers and sisters who
Right.
are being impacted in that way. And so we know that they're not bad people. We know they experienced a trauma, that they maybe sought care for years and started to self medicate. And so um, we definitely, the human element kind of gets erased within the rhetoric and the criminal system, oftentimes in those conversations. So it's really meaningful to have those voices of people who are directly impacted being a part of this work, being a part of the conversations with leaders in our communities, so that we actually can work together about, what was missing, what happened in that person's life, that when they were victimized, right, we didn't respond with appropriate care at that time. We have this punitive approach, but the quote unquote justice system didn't give the victim justice. There oftentimes when you see people in our jails and prisons and you talk with them, they themselves were victims at some point, and oftentimes are caught up and then criminalize themselves, be
Right.
it through trafficking, be it through physical violence and acts towards them. And they will tell you oftentimes too that the responses they got from the system when they were victimized didn't make them feel like that was healing, did not make that feel like they got justice. And so
Right.
they went through other avenues that ultimately then catch them in that same system.
So like if we were to put this in like plain language, would this be a way that sort of you see this play out? Um, you have a relative, the relative has, let's say, schizophrenia, and it plays out for them sometimes in unattractive ways, maybe even where they like kind of lose it one day and maybe beat up on somebody, let's just say that. And so they're deemed violent, and there's not and if they happen to be poor, um they're just not really in the treatment system like they like we should, and we direct them toward the criminal system over time, and then you're just in this cycle that you just cannot get out of. Is that sort of like some of the things that you see?
Absolutely. I mean, I lost a dear friend in November 2024, Brianna Danielle Evans, in the Washington County Detention Center, because of her severe schizophrenia. There was no great placement for her and all the trauma she has sustained in her life. And unfortunately, we held her in a facility and didn't know what to do. And ultimately, she lost her life. And so, I mean, definitely, those are things that play out every single day across the state of Arkansas.
You know, I I want to like play with like two different stories that just come to mind because I I actually look at this and say, boy, this is a complicated problem. And I think that, and I don't know if you advocate for this stuff in different ways, but I think just lengthening prison systems just generally, it doesn't solve the problem, and it just perpetuates this very expensive solution that also destroys lives, right? And so Now, if you were the victim, though, you would not, and I'm going to give a victim story. You don't feel so, you don't care, right? And so, like, I want to focus on like, how do you change minds? Also, if we don't, if we have like mandatory sentencing without somebody to be able to consider all the facts, or parole that we don't, like, we just basically almost take it away. I wonder if those levers, we think they serve us by making them tougher, but they really don't. So I don't know, do you advocate for fixing some of the things that I just said, or do I really not, are those not things to really focus on, in your opinion, having kind of been involved with this for so long?
Yeah. Well, I'm never advocating that folks shouldn't be accountable.
Right, of course.
So, yeah. And so really victims, obviously should have that rectified. They should have healing, and they should have, but I think that, again, a case-by-case basis, it looks different. Restorative justice models have been shown to be very effective to create, healing for all parties and for the community that's been harmed. And you're right. And you have criminologists. If you look at the data, there is no correlation that lengthier sentences make us any safer or are current towards those acts. But yet we continue to make that our kind of tired solution that we offer. And unfortunately too, right, it actually decreases safety, because as you have somebody left in the system for a really long time and they're institutionalized, whenever they go to re-enter, then it's really hard for them to successfully be a part of our community. And then there's a higher likelihood that they create additional victimization in our communities.
Yes, they just don't know. You're there for however many years. So there's so many different examples. So, there's two examples that I can think of where, one that's sort of, both of them are just scary. But so there was, and one of these happened in Fayetteville. There was, and this happened to a young college student from Russellville. There was a guy that I guess was on some sort of drugs, heroin, meth. I'm not really sure, and probably with a cocktail of mental health problems, that broke into these guys' house while they were out on a weekend night. One of them shows up early. This guy that's in their house holds him hostage. This guy had gone into their house, put on this array of their clothes, had booby trapped some things. And so the kid that's there is trying to talk this guy off the ledge. And the rest of them show up a few hours later, and the doors are locked. They can sort of see this thing happening. One of them breaks in, goes into his room, grabs a gun, didn't load it, points it at this guy, and then and he ends up getting shot and killed. And so that same guy then gets put in jail and kills his cellmate. And so I don't know if you remember this story. This happened about 3 or 4 years ago. When I hear about those kind of people, those sort of things are say like, okay, those people I really want off the street. And so I don't know his story, but I look at it in like you said earlier, we want to hold him accountable. And I sort of for me personally, that's a scary story. There's another story about a Russellville kid, a little bit older. He actually his family has a business not too far from mine. And this young man had a lot of people stealing at a junkyard, and a lot of people stealing from him. And noticed there's two different versions of the story, but I'll just tell you the story that he got arrested with. That he had noticed these two guys that had sort of been scouting the property. This is the sort of property you would go on, pull something off a car, bring it back to the front and pay for it. And they had stacked some stuff up apparently. And so the young man sort of thought, oh, they're coming back to steal, And so this guy came back with in full camo and had a long range rifle. And when these boys broke in, he shot him, and then he put him in the back of he did some bad things. And so I tell this story because when I think about it, they put both of these people in jail for life, and so because they applied the same thing to the same thing. And I look at them and I just say, okay, one of them I think is, I just wonder okay, the guy that shot somebody that came in, broke in, I wonder if is putting someone in jail for life really the answer here? I know if you were the victim on the other side of it, you would say absolutely. But sometimes I just think, golly, our system just doesn't work to solve the problems. It just has a lock them up and throw away the key thing, and so, I don't know where to, to take you with that exactly, but, I'm sure that like, are you down there saying to people like, for gosh sakes, let's apply not one size fits all, or, and is it gotten worse or better since you've done this? Does the state made progress, or are we going backwards?
Woof, well, that was a lot.
I know, sorry.
I mean, those are awful and tragic situations. And
Of
again,
course, yeah.
they deserve justice. They deserve accountability. And I think, the current tools that we have don't allow for there to be, like you said, the ability to really look at those unique instances, right, to determine kind of what that accountability looks like. So there's a sentencing grid, and it's like, this is what we're going to basically do. And I think about it a lot like, as a mom to two kids, I don't parent my two kids the same because they're not the same. They don't have
Right.
this neuro makeup. They don't, one is really sensitive and emotional, and my other one is more stoic, and, different things work for them. And so we're no different as adult beings that have so many things that have either occurred in their life. But I also, too, want to go back and center back on the victim
Right.
because, there are some people that say they want to lock folks up forever, but
Of course.
oftentimes I talk to individuals who've been victims, and they're frustrated because because of the system and the way it's structured, they don't actually want to go through the process that is unfolding before them, and it's happening outside of their will and what they want to occur. And so that really disrespects the victim too. And so there is a balancing act of figuring out if we can have conversations about, structuring, the rules of these systems so that they do allow for there to be variability. And I think that that's been a hard conversation to have because over the years, what I have seen is that we have seen a much more punitive legislature. We got truth in sentencing that happened with the Protect Arkansas Act.
Right. Those are 23. Is that right? Something like that.
Correct. And,
Yeah.
It made a lot of mandatory time on certain charges. It had some language in it that was supposed to do some more helpful things. And, that's been minimally touched. But what we have done is we've done the more punitive side of that.
course.
And so
Yeah.
just the balancing act has been, or, just the logical, if you move one thing, you really need to look at, the scales of justice you think about too, that balancing. And we do a lot over again on that punitive side, but really trying to figure out like that balance part and looking at that resourcing that needs to go into our community. Because for victims too, it doesn't just happen with locking the person up. Again, the victim then, they may need counseling that they can't access because they don't have appropriate insurances.
Right.
They might have additional ongoing long-term things that oftentimes our state is not structured in a way to help to support them. And so they either fall into greater despair, poverty, or themselves end up in the criminal system.
Right. Well, you're a politician, if you were in charge of it all, what are some of the things that you would do? What would be your list of like, these are the two or three things that I would for sure focus on?
Yeah. I mean, one of the, things that we continually advocate for is getting resources directly into our communities. And so being proactive and getting to the root of things, children, if they're not reading by proficiently by third grade, they have a high likelihood that they're pathing towards the prison system. And so giving appropriate supports to children, universal pre-K, and then supports for those families when they're struggling to wrap around services and support so that those families can stay together and be strong. And so, they can be successful. Additionally, we have an opportunity to really expand our healthcare responses across our state. I mean, our rural communities in particular are in crisis.
Right, they are.
We're in a mental health crisis, so we really have to entice and make changes that allow for us to have appropriate clinicians in the state of Arkansas. And then we have to remove the barriers that oftentimes are, private insurance is the preference for many of these providers. But we live in a state that has incredible poverty. And then, that's a whole thing too, is that we have to tackle poverty. And I want to see us really finding ways that Arkansans can have greater economic mobility. and educational opportunities, because we know that the more educated folks are, they move away from being captured in the criminal system.
Right. Well, okay. So what you would do is you would say, hey, let's go look at some of the root things that are driving it. So poverty, education, mental health, and just healthcare, because it all links. So, in Arkansas counties, about 70% of them have primary care physician scarcity. So just forget mental health professionals, just primary care physicians. Would that play out in just trying to create more access in terms of healthcare, so that you had choices?
Well, and I think, again, it's listening to the issues directly from, clinicians and the conditions I see in Arkansas that are preventing them from wanting to practice here. And so part of it is the structure of how we educate and residency type programs, that have not been available. So strengthening those programs, and then having enticing conditions, to try to encourage folks to practice in certain spaces. I mean, I live in Northwest Arkansas, which,
Right.
people think is the land of milk and honey. But we really struggle. And the reason our crisis stabilization unit ended up closing is really because some of those, specific, even just tech, it's the whole spectrum of healthcare, from, a primary physician all the way to a healthcare tech, that we really struggle to get those roles. The bodies are not available. Folks maybe even get educated in those spaces and they leave Arkansas for other greener pastures in other states. And so I feel like there's been lots of conversations over the last several years where those people that participate in those spaces, they know what's needed. And so I think we just really have to listen to them and fix those things.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I think Fayetteville and Northwest Arkansas are, quite frankly, the tip of the spear, for the state. I don't know if you think that or not, but, if you look at just simple things in terms of GDP growth in the state, if you look at just where the growth in population is occurring, I mean, heck, a lot of the counties in the state of Arkansas lost population, and that's a bad formula for us, right? And you throw in the farming crisis, right? Like, no one's going to make money doing farming this year. So, in a lot of ways, you're at the epicenter of like, how do we like put forth ideas? So like even things like this is the county jail like, do they have the problems in Washington and Benton County with county jails as like they do it? So in Polk County, we have an overflowing of a county jail because there's not room in other jails, but voters won't vote to increase the size of the jail in Polk County. So that just, which tells me, well, which I find is really interesting, but I don't know what's going on in Washington and Benton County related to that.
Well, I mean, across the state, I think we have similar concerns and issues. There's, again, a very, simple viewpoint that I think has gotten us here, that population growth equals we lock more people up. We've done the data and shown the analysis. Criminal charges don't run hand in hand with your population. The things that crime is a social construct. Like when we go to the legislature, we get to make up what we want to say we don't like. And if somebody breaks the rule, we put them in jail, right? That's what we decide. And so, really, these are local policy decisions about how we do our operations. The Department of Justice has a jail planning standards guide, and it says, if you have a jail bed, you will fill it. That you have to have the accountability to set policy in your community about how you're going to manage those bed spaces for your public safety. And we do not exercise that restraint and that control in the state of Arkansas. Across the state, we do not value looking at the data and the evidence of criticizing or being critical of what we're doing. Right. And in most county jails in the state of Arkansas, we're locking people up because they're too poor to buy their freedom.
Right. They just can't pay for they can't pay for the bonding to get out.
So we're okay to spend $25,000 to $30,000 a year to house them in a local jail facility, but we don't want to provide a fraction of that to put them in housing that might stabilize their lives. And, at any time in Washington County, 80 people of the 700 are going to have to be unhoused or list Seven Hills as their housing location.
Yeah, and that's a shame. So you do something small, and you're in the county jail for a while.
Yeah. And Department of Justice also across the state, all 75 counties, it's over 30 county jails that we have in Arkansas. Pretrial services is a gold standard from the 90s. It's happening right up the road in Douglas County, Kansas, which is a comparable area to Washington County. That allows for hundreds of people to be released out of facilities with wraparound supports for a fraction of what it costs to continually lock folks up, and it doesn't decrease public safety. Yet, again, there's nowhere in Arkansas that we're putting in practice something like this. And so, what I would say is that we have small and medium and large policy levers and investments that are a fraction of building more facilities. And I think the public has become savvy to that. And we don't want business as usual. We're not going to continue to do this lock them up. It costs us too much money.
It's way too much money
financially, but the human cost to it in our communities, we watch people be ground up enough close to us. And I'm hearing much more often over the last year that folks are very tired of seeing that as our solution.
Yeah, because I think that, like, if I go back to the story of the young man that shot the guy and shot the two guys that were stealing, if I tell that story in Russellville, a lot of people some people will say, look, if because the guys that actually got shot had this long list of apparently criminal offenses, and they were clearly in the act of a crime. And so a lot of people that I would talk to there would say, like, yeah, this guy shouldn't be in jail at all. I sort of look at it and I say, well, to me, it's an example of where we're going to take on as a state this massive expense for someone's lifetime, not counting the healthcare expense of somebody. And I would say that if I were in charge, I would have more flexible sentencing that's more specific to exactly what happened. I wouldn't have mandatory sentence. Maybe I'd have guidelines. I would try to shift dollars, from keeping people in jail for a long time, because most violent crimes are committed by males. Most of them are between 18 and 35 years old. You don't have a ton of guys that are 65, committing violent crimes, right? I mean, they certainly could have mental health issues, right? And I would shift dollars down into mental health issues, broadly, healthcare, education. I'm not exactly sure where it fits, but where we could do it in a different way, as opposed to lock them up and throw away the key. And because, like you said, I think that there's this systemic things that happens. It's so.
And the majority of charges that happen in the state of Arkansas are not violent. The majority of people in county jails are in on nonviolent charges. And so I know we've talked about particular incidences that have been fortunately violent, but most people, and even, the theft you talked about, is driven because of, quick access to funds to then, go self-medicate, right? And so all these folks that are in our county jails, the majority of them are not going to the prison system. They're going to go back out into our communities after sometimes lengthy time in county jails on supervision. And so instead, thinking about, like you said, putting the investment in and understanding 90% of folks in Washington County a couple of summers ago, when we talked to them in intake, they shared that they had mental health, addiction and recovery needs, and that they, had tried over the years to access those, and for, different reasons were not able to get those. And so, just removing some of those barriers can help to be, preventative.
One of the things I like about what you do here is that, it's you're standing up for the people who don't have a voice. It's because really, how many people are standing up and saying, like, this person that did something that sounds really awful, but you're throwing them in jail forever is just the wrong thing. And it's so easy just to say, that person did the wrong thing. And we could give gobs of examples here. I want to switch gears for a second, because I think there's other things where I find really interesting about you. I've heard you say, or something to the effect of, like, what you want your daughters to grow up in Fayetteville, right? And I wasn't 100% sure exactly what you meant. So the way I interpreted with what you were saying is that you wanted a location where, like a place to live where I'm using my own words now, so you just tell me if this is kind of what you meant, where everybody could still be part of the community because it's accessible to everybody, so you could be the barista and still have a place to live, and you could be the CEO and still have a place to live and interact together. Is that sort of what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I love Fayetteville. I came to Fayetteville, it was my beacon of hope in the late 90s. And I talked to so many people that say the same thing. And I had this realization a handful of years ago in talking to my daughters who also love Fayetteville so much that they have this idea in their mind, right, that Fayetteville will always be for them. And what I
Right.
was thinking increasingly was my oldest daughter is neurodivergent. She has autism. And I was increasingly seeing a city and a region that was not going to have a place potentially for her and some of the children that she was in school with. And I just, it ignited something. I mean, I already have, family members with serious mental illness and addiction needs that I've struggled to find resources. And you will do anything for your kids. And I love the children she goes to school with. I feel a great responsibility to them. And I feel fiercely protective of Fayetteville because I hear so many folks who come from Forest City with $20 in their pocket looking
Right.
for opportunity. And he'll hear people when they see policies in Fayetteville say, this gives me hope, or, I feel safe here. And I think those are things worth fiercely protecting. That's why I continue to work on the city council. That's why I get into conversations that can be incredibly uncomfortable, is because, this place is incredibly special to me. I think it's worth protecting. I think it's worth making sure there's a place for everybody.
Well, economic segregation is all over the United States. So you just pick like a vacation town, right? Like if you were to say like Aspen, Colorado, right? The home prices are totally ridiculous. And if you're a billionaire, you can own one of the places there, right? And you can live close in right next to the ski resort. But if you're the barista, like that's not going to work. You're 30 miles away driving in, right? And so, um, and then you've got the emergence of things like Airbnbs right there in Bentonville, all around that county square. You've got as the university in Fayetteville grows, you've got like serious fans that want to buy like a house or a condo because they want to there for the. And so part of me says like this is around like really smart long-term thinking so that you get the whole thing right, like the infrastructure, the transportation, the water, the sewer, the trash, the green space. How do you think, how's Fayetteville doing on that? Do you feel like they're got good plans and good thinking this through, or is it like developers can do what they want to do?
Woo! How long do we have?
Yeah,
No, I mean, it's as I came onto council, one of the reasons I ran was because I was concerned that we were in this incredible pinch point and that the decisions we were making at that time, were going to have incredible consequences. And so, I think we have to continue to act with urgency. I think we're we're on a pathway. I mean, we have, lots of infrastructure, not unlike other places that, is woefully under maintained.
Right.
And so, we have a huge bond issue. And one of the biggest things is, our water and sewer. We have to make sure that our treatment facility gets the improvements that it needs, right? Because we do have so many neighbors that we're welcoming. I think Fayetteville is poised to continue to lead in the state. We know that we'll be the number one population city over time. That's what we're projected to be. And so I feel like we have incredible plans. We've had this like incredible vision. And so it's really making sure that we are creating smarter policies, removing some of our barriers where there is regulatory that's keeping certain things from opening up. And it's making sure that we're laser focused on those investments that are going to really push us towards our biggest strategic priorities. And we have a lot of challenges, but we also have a lot of opportunities. And,
oh yeah,
and I
huge.
think that we have a right set of leadership today that we are willing to really like try things as well. I think we've sometimes been a bit risk averse, and I just think given the challenges we face, we're going to have to lean in. We're going to have to take some risk, and so I'm looking forward to us really trying to incubate some new things. Borrow from some other places around the world and tweak it for Fayetteville's uses. But I'm confident we're on a good trajectory, but I also think we have to continue to act with a greater sense of urgency and use a spectrum of responses. We've got some very immediate things we need to keep doing. And then we've got some midterm, next 3 to 5 years, and then some, 10-year type stuff that we're in process for. But, roadways are always a conversation. We're talking about waste. I mean, we're not going to get another landfill. We're going to have to be smarter about how we, work with our residents too, for them to be, better educated on how they reduce their footprints. And then with the waste that comes into our stream, again, we're going to have to make, hard conversation changes potentially on things maybe we've done a certain way. And we're about to implement that with our recycling, right? We're going to do things a little bit differently than we have, because we're trying to think about how do we get more participation in these things too that move our city forward.
Well, some of these things, even like recycling, I'll just use this as an example. Sometimes we do things and it can get colored politically, like, oh, that's some green thing that alt left people want to go do, things like that. But when we come to actual waste, the reality is we have landfill scarcity in the United States. There's only 1,200 landfills left. And it doesn't matter if you're in the reddest of red counties, because this is the business that I'm in. It is super hard to get something permitted. You have to have all things kind of going. And, what 24% of what goes in U.S. landfills is food waste and certain different makes, plus just things we're throwing away constantly, plastics, cardboard, etc. And, I think that we could live in a world where we just dig holes and throw it all in, or we could live in a world where we actually do something beneficial for it, right? And so, I applaud you guys thinking progressively, because, I think that if we want to go out 30 years and say, where do people want to live? I think people want to live where, the taxes are reasonable, it's safe, you've got good schools, good access to things like mental health, but along the way, not turning into places where it just the balance gets switched. The other day I was in Russellville, the mayor of Russellville, one of his backgrounds is called the Rust Bus, and it's about helping homeless people. I don't know if you're familiar with what Fred's done at all, but
I'm going to look into that now.
So he's been very, very active in homelessness, and in Russellville, you don't really see it; it's invisible, right? But it's there, and I'm sure it's there in Fayetteville as well. It's so, but how does cities manage that where it doesn't turn into, I was in Portland, Oregon the other day, and Portland's a wonderful city, right? It's got all these great things, but it's got a bunch of people in tents, that are living just in vestibules, and you sit there and go we got to figure out other solutions. People living on the streets isn't I don't think it's a great solution, and so somehow we got to figure some of these things out to help these people, because, I don't know if this is true, what's going on in, there, but in Russellville, I know our church has this thing called the Manna House, and we feed people. It's basically if you have food scarcity, you can come there and we'll give you a meal and give you groceries. And we've seen the numbers go way up recently, and it's interesting. It's the dichotomy, because you hear things like I heard this statistic that last year more Americans went on European vacations than ever before, but at the same time we had the most numbers at food banks around the United States.
It's like a growing gap. Yeah,
it's this gap.
And we're seeing it in Fayetteville. We have 22%, even again an area of opportunity, 22% poverty. And when we looked at our economics, we've had a decline in wage growth, and so even in places too where it seems like things are going really well, there are incredible challenges before us.
Yeah, well, you got to do the yeoman's work. So I applaud you, because a lot of it's happening at the ground level, like at city councils, right? They only could do so much at the state level. I mean, they can do certain things that for sure impact you, but you're in a place where, and maybe I'll end it on this. As I go around the United States for various reasons with work, et cetera, it used to be when I talked about Arkansas, people would be if I said I was from Denver, let's just make that up, or Austin, people are like, oh, that's awesome, that's cool. If I said I was from Arkansas, they go, Arkansas, well, I've never really been there, right? And it was it sort of kind of sounded like okay, but it sort of felt like a criticism, and now what happens is I go around, Arkansas still gets the and it still gets this impression because it's, we're high on the violent crime list, right? We're things like that. We're low on national merit scholars and just stuff like that. And so, but there is a bright spot because people know about Bentonville and Northwest Arkansas and what's going on up there, and it's got a really wonderful reputation. So I hope you keep it. I hope you still, the leadership up there it's the unlocking move.
Well, and I thank you. I also think unfortunately, those kind of national headlines about things, as much as I love Northwest Arkansas and want to tout it, I also want to say they're just incredible places across the state. And, hope too that we can look at the support to be able to help those communities because oftentimes, they're losing population and tax base, but there's incredible energy that comes out of the Delta and other parts in Arkansas. So I don't want to discount the contributions they make to our state. And also the melting pot across the state as we have people that in our region, are not necessarily homegrown to, Fayetteville in our region. They come from other places across Arkansas.
They do.
Originating in Pine Bluff, which I love dearly. So I want to also too just lift up those other parts of our state because we have an incredible culture and history across Arkansas with the contributions. And Northwest Arkansas, while we have certain drivers, I want to give accolades to all the things that have been birthed across. Our president came from another place, and the blues, et cetera.
Well, the Delta contributes the largest. I mean, the ag in the Delta region is the largest contributor to GDP in the state. It's like 13, 14%, something like that, depending on what you count in agriculture. And so, but it's got all sorts of problems, and so, it's tough, even in Yell County, if you looked at it, back in the 80s, there was a lot of row crop farmers there. There aren't row crop farmers at scale in Yell County any longer. A lot of that's flipped into timber. And so what happens when that does is it just, there's places on the map in Yell County where I live that used to be towns that are not towns any longer.
Yeah.
They used to have a school. They don't have a school any longer. And it's because there's the economics have shifted into like places like Russellville. So anyway,
well, you're right though on your comment. I do want to just, as people are watching this, I really want to encourage folks to, and the reason, you call me a politician. I always kind of cringe when I hear that. I really was a concerned community member who, ran for office because I knew that we could put in place local policies that could be incredibly impactful and shape and change, the way that our community lived. And so we have that opportunity across all these hundreds of cities in our state to do that.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean it pejoratively. I actually meant it really in a complimentary fashion. I think that, God, standing up is hard, right? It takes a lot of energy. It's not easy to run for office. And, today's, social media, God knows what people have to endure, even politicians, I don't necessarily like their policies. I feel bad that like just the amount of negativity thrown at them. I just think it's so unhelpful. And, and it makes it just harder to get the answers. But anyway, Sarah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. And, keep up the good work on things you guys are doing at the city of Fayetteville. We the state needs you guys. And, keep up the good work on justice reform because, it's super important too.
Thank you. I appreciate it.